right, we're ready for Psalm 55 to 58 in our study tonight. These are all Psalms are important Psalms, but particularly Psalm 55 is an outstanding Psalm that if you haven't committed not the passage itself to memory, but the principle to memory, that this is the place to go look for some principles. And it's very packed full with a lot of practical things here in Psalm 55. So let's go to, before we look at that, let's go to our questions for tonight or our handout. What type of psalm is Psalm 55? Remember, the types of psalms may overlap a little bit. It could classify in this category and that one as well. Did you put a type to it? It's not an imprecatory psalm, obviously. It's not messianic. Yeah, it's a prayer, it's a plea, and a plea for help. Its author is David, as all the Psalms are tonight. And so what's the message? The point? Subject. All right, he's sorely distressed. It's good. What else? All right, he's surrounded by wickedness and wants to fly away, and he's being treated treacherously. And how does he deal with that? That's what this psalm is about. Irvin Jensen called this the Psalm of the Sore Distressed. I like that wording. He says the Psalm of the Sore Distressed. It's the ode of the oppressed, Scroggie said. Perhaps this is at the time of Absalom's rebellion and Ahithophel's treachery, recorded in 2 Samuel 15 to 18. He has been betrayed by someone. He feels that he is being treated ungodly, and he wished he could just get away from all of that. Scroggie suggested that mingled emotions meet here, as they do in the experience of us all. And here, as always, they are determined by the occasion and incidentally give us the main divisions of the psalm. And hence he talks about the distress found in verses 1 to 8. That is, he is thinking of himself. And then there is indignation. He's thinking of his foe. That's verses 9 to 15. And his confidence as he thinks about God. Now, that's not the outline we're going to follow. It is basically the division, but I like Scroggie's division of that and how he's broke that down, that he is in distress, and because of that, here is some indignation that he has, and then it results ultimately in confidence. He thinks of himself, turns and thinks of his foe, and he ultimately must think about God. I like what Scroggie says. He said, it is well that the thought does not move in the opposite direction. And what he means by that is he starts on the note of thinking about himself and turns and thinks about God. Better that than think about God and then quit and end up thinking of ourselves. But there's another thought in that, and that is he thinks about flying away, but rather he chooses to fly to God. Better that it works in that direction than in the opposite. And Scroggie is absolutely correct. All right, so the psalm is about, I simply call it, frustration turns to trust. Here is the psalmist who is frustrated, but at the end of the psalm, his frustration has turned to trust. And so it's the story of much like we sing a song, all of self and none of thee. And the song is about a journey and a process we're going through that at the end, it's all of God and none of us. And so the psalmist starts out on this note that I wished I could just fly away and be at rest. And we'll get to that in a second. And then he says, I put my trust and my confidence in God. I'm not going to fly away. I'm running to God. Instead of running away, I run to God. And what a psalm indeed this is. So here's the 3 points that we're going to follow. There's a frustrated heart. There's a wicked friend. This is not a dreaded enemy. in the sense, it is an enemy, but it's not a dreaded enemy like some foreign king is invading. This is betrayal of a friend. And finally, there's the resolve in God. Questions or comments about where the psalm is going? Let's talk about the condition he's in, verses 1 to 5. This is how he felt. Not saying it was justified, not saying this is the thought everybody ought to have. The psalmist is saying, this is how I felt. Much like that song I just mentioned a moment ago where we start out, all of self and none of thee. That's not saying that's what we ought to have. It's just saying that's where we were. That's where we were. All right? What does he say in verses 1 to 5 now about how he felt? Now look at verse 2. So first he begs God to give your ear to my prayer. Do not hide yourself from my supplication. Attend to me. I am restless in my complaint and moan noisily. I'm restless. What does he mean he's restless? He can't find peace or comfort. Yeah, good description. That it doesn't seem like anywhere I turn, there's nothing I can do to gain some comfort. I am restless. I am not at peace. I'm disturbed. I'm frustrated. Not only is he restless, notice at verse 3a, he's oppressed because of the voices of the enemy. You'll see more about his relationship with this enemy a little bit later in the context. And because of the oppression of the wicked. And so I am being oppressed by someone. Look at verse 3b. He's hated. He feels like he's hated. For they bring down trouble upon me, and in wrath they hate me. Again, this very well may be Absalom that he's dealing with, and the evidence of that I think is going to be found a little bit later in verses 13 and 14. But this is how he feels. I feel like I am restless, I'm oppressed, I'm hated. Look at verse 4. What do you see at verse 4? In anguish. My heart is severely pained within me. There is a heartache, there is anguish. And then in verse 5, he says, fearfulness and trembling have come up on me, and horror has overwhelmed me. This is how I feel. This is his condition. You ever feel that way? Do you ever feel some problem has come in your direction? Maybe you helped bring it on yourself, and we'll talk about that in a moment, or maybe someone else brought it up on you. You feel like you've been betrayed, and you just feel restless, you feel fearful, you feel hated, you feel oppressed, you feel like there's a heartache. Here's some lessons that we're going to learn. There will be trouble in your life. There was in David's life. That may be caused by us. We may have some of our self-inflicted problems. It may be caused by our disloyalty. It could be caused because of our loyalty is why there's problems. How could that be? You were loyal, you were faithful, you were diligent, you were a loyal friend, you're loyal to God, and still trouble comes. Maybe because of that. Is that possible? How so? Absolutely. Job would well fit that. Our problems could be caused by other people, and that fits the case in this psalm. Someone else has done something to you. You're innocent. And doesn't mean you never could have done anything wrong. It just means you're innocent in this circumstance, and you've been wronged by someone else. In other words, I'm learning from this there's going to be trouble. Well, here was his thoughts. Now, we saw his condition in verses 1 to 5. Starting at verse 6, here's what he thought, what he wanted to do. This was my reaction at first. So look at verse 6. This is a key to what the psalm is about. And you might underline this. Highlight it if you're an electronic text. And I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, and then I'd fly away and be at rest. What's he saying? Anywhere but here. Yeah, I want to retreat. I want to get away from here. If I had the wings of a dove, I'd fly away. I'd just get out of here. I'd just go away from here. I'd run from the problem. And I'd get out of here. You ever feel that way? I just wished I was a bird and I'd just fly out of this mess. I'd just get out of here. I wouldn't stay around and deal with this. He said, I wished I could do that. Look at verse 7. We'll come back to that. Verse 7, he wished he could do what? Same principle, but I could wander off and go to the wilderness and remain in the wilderness. And in verse 8, another word for the same thing, I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. I feel like I'm in a storm. I feel like the wind is blowing. I feel like I'm in the midst of a hurricane or a storm at sea. And I wished I could just escape all this. Wished I could get away from all. That's what I wanted to do. I wished I could just run away. You learn anything from that? Yeah. They're looking for some kind of escape. I just want to get away, and this is my means of at least mentally getting away from the problem. You're right. Good point. One writer said, running is easy, but rarely is it wise. Another writer suggested, you don't need a change in circumstance, you need a change in attitude. And that's what David did here. He changed his attitude, didn't change his circumstance. We often think that security is found in solitude, that if I could just go be by myself and get away from everybody else, but security is seldom ever found there. A quote from Scroggie again. Scroggie said, the fleeing dove might light on a thorn. I like that. You fly away to be at rest, and you might light somewhere where it's not as nice there as it is here. It may not be as well there as it is here. You may have greater problems there than you had here. Running is not always the answer. All right, let's talk about the wicked friend. Now that's how the condition he was in and how he felt, what he thought about. But then he turns and focuses on his wicked friend. Verses 9 to 15. Let's look at verses 9 to 11. It talks about how wicked the world was around. What do you see in 9 through 11? Yeah, destroy it right in the midst. Good analogy with the Tower of Babel. Absolutely. And notice this at verse 10. Day and night they go around on its walls. In other words, they look around in the city, and it's like in every street and all around, there's all kinds of violence, there's all kinds of sin, there's all kinds of corruption. In other words, it's just a poetic picture of a world of iniquity and wickedness all around. And so David is saying here that the world is just wicked around. And in the middle of that, I think what he's doing in verses 9 through 11 is like an artist painting this backdrop of this dark picture of a wicked world. And growing out of that comes this wicked friend. And so what we have in verses 12 to 15 is I have a friend that betrayed me. So let's look at verses 12 and 13. His point here, and see if you don't see this, that it would be better if it were not a friend. Now let's stop and pause, and then we'll get the verse. You understand that if you are injured verbally by a friend or a brother or family member, it'd be a whole lot easier to take if it was a stranger that said that to you. You could shrug it off. Let's see if that's what he's saying. For if it were an enemy who reproached me, then I could bear it. If it was a wicked king or a soldier from another army, I could handle that. Nor is it he one who hates me, who magnifies himself against me, then I would hide from him. But it was you, a man, my equal, my companion, and my acquaintance. It'd been a whole lot better if it wasn't a friend. What does he say at verse 14? Yeah, this is the way it used to be. There was a time we were close and we were united. That's part of what makes it hurt. Have you ever been I don't mean physically injured, but have you ever been injured by a friend, a close friend, and what really makes it hurt is the fact that you one time were close. Look at verse 14. We took sweet counsel together. We walked to the house of God in the throng. I mean, we used to go to the house of worship hand in hand, walking together and worshiping together. And we had sweet counsel together. Probably talking about Absalom here. That hurt. That really, really hurt. Now drop to verses 20 and 21 because it's not really in this group of 9 to 15, but what 20 and 21 does is tell us the characteristics of this friend. So let's drop down to 20 and 21. That he put forth his hands against those who were at peace with him. That tells me this was unprovoked. So it's not that David had done something and now this is retaliation. It was unprovoked. That makes it hurt even more. I've done nothing to cause this injury. Look at verse 20 and verse 20b. He has broken his covenant, which means his word means nothing. That hurts. When someone you were close to says something to you and their promises mean nothing. When they say, I'm going to do better, I'm going to treat you right, I'm sorry, and they betray that confidence or that promise, that makes it hurt even worse. Here's something else. Look at verse 21a. He's a hypocrite. The words are smoother, of his mouth are smoother than butter, but war is in his heart. He says one thing, but we got a knife in his hand. He's holding out an olive branch, but he's got a knife in his hand ready to kill. He's a hypocrite. He's dangerous, verse 21. And then look at verse 19. This is a key verse for a practical lesson. He refuses to change. God will hear and afflict them, even he who abides from old, because they do not change, therefore they do not fear God. In other words, he refuses to change because he has no fear of God. Let's stop and footnote. It's a practical lesson before we get away from that verse. What did you just learn from verse 19 about the fear of God? Fear of God will cause us to make changes. When I refuse to change, my problem is I don't fear God. What a practical lesson. All right, let's go further. Now, we're still talking about this wicked friend. There's this wicked world around, the dark picture, out of which grows this wicked friend, verses 12 to 14. He has the same end of all those who are wicked. What do you see at verse 15? Let death seize them, let them go down to Sheol. Yeah, let him go among those who are wicked. He has the same end. And this is part of what makes it hurt. When you've been betrayed by someone that was supposed to be a person in covenant relationship with God, and they've betrayed you and they're now committing sin and evil, that not only have they betrayed you, and you once had a close relationship, but they're headed toward destruction like all the other wicked. Now that hurts. Does that make sense? Now let's look at some practical things we learned. What David is saying here, the wounds of a friend hurt most. Lupo calls this a formerly trusted friend. Do we have a description of a hot friend grown cold? This was a hot friend that grew cold. This hurts. This is why this is such a popular psalm among students of the text. We can identify. Questions or comments so far? All right. Let's talk about the last section of the psalm where he has this resolve in God and he resolves to do some things. I've been betrayed. I feel so frustrated I'm ready to fly away and be at rest. Here's the description of my wicked friend who betrayed me. But here's what I resolve to do now. And so let's see what he says. Verse 16 to 19a, he resolves to pray. So let's start at verse 16. As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. What else does he say about prayer in verse 17? Say again. Frequently. Regularly. Evening and morning and noon. Remember Daniel praying 3 times a day? Daniel 6. As was his custom since the early days. And I will pray and I'll cry out loud. You'll hear my voice. So at verse 16, verse 17, verse 19, he's very confident God's going to hear. So know that I will call on God and he'll save me. I will cry aloud and he'll hear my voice. God will hear, verse 19. He's praying with confidence. I'm going to pray and God's going to hear me. Now verse 22, you might circle verse 22. And if you are so disposed to mark and draw lines from one verse to another, well, I want you to notice at verse 22, he's casting his burden upon God. Cast your burden on the Lord and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. That's the exact opposite of what verse 6 had said. Because at verse 6, I thought about running away. What I've decided to do now is run to God. What a change. What a change. We'll come back to that here in a moment. Here's what I'm learning from that. Turn our complaints to God. Problems should drive us to God, not away. How many times have you noted someone that had deep troubles, relationships troubles? I mean, somebody at church really got under their skin and they give up on God. They run away from God. David didn't do that. David ran to God, not away from God. Troubles ought to drive us to God instead of away from God. Crikey says difficulties are instruments of discipline. I think that's a good way of wording that, and prayer will sustain a troubled heart is what I'm learning from that. Now verse 19b through verse 23 is he has this resolve to trust. I'm resolved I'm going to pray. Now I want to go back to verse 16 before I leave that prayer. As for me, I will call upon God. I take that to be saying more than, well, I decided I'd pray. Couldn't do anything else. I think what he's saying is, what I determined to do is I'd pray. Notice he doesn't mention retaliation. I'm going to get even with my friend. But as for me, I decided to pray. I resolved to pray. Here's something else I resolved to do. Put my trust in God. Look at verse 19. I trust that he's going to punish the wicked. What does that have to do with all this? Well, let's get to point, verse 19. That God will hear and will afflict them, verse 19. And then verse 23, that you shall bring them down to the pit of destruction. I trust God will ultimately punish the wicked. How does that encourage you? Yeah.
That's our human nature. Well, they're getting away with it. And we think it's our job to stand in and say, you know what, you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. In the end, God.
All right, yeah. I think they're getting away if I turn to God instead of maybe turning to retaliation. And so consequently, here's a comforting thought. God's going to deal with that. God's going to deal with that in the end. So I trust God's going to handle this. God's going to settle the score. Score needs to be settled. God's going to do that, ultimately. All right? The second thing, I trust that he will sustain and bless the righteous. We just saw that at verse 22, that he will never permit the righteous to be moved. Notice at the end of the psalm, you might underline, but I will trust in you. That's what the psalm is about. I put my trust in you. I want you to note this change. This is the most fascinating part of the psalm in my mind. That he starts on this note, he thought about flying away. Oh, that I had wings of dove and I'd fly away and I'd be at rest. And he changed to saying, I'll cast my burden on the Lord and he'll sustain me. God will sustain me. And I trust that God will sustain me. And I'll put my trust in him. Better to fly to God than to fly away. Make sense? You ever feel like David? I think I'd just like to fly away. I wished I had wings. If I did, I'd just fly to this mess. And be better to fly to God than away. Make sense? Practical things now. Psalm 55 that we haven't already listed. What do you learn? We intended to spend more time with this psalm, and we did.
Can't help but it personalizes me that David is just another man just like we are, and how bad we get about things. We say the same things about our enemies, but he gives us the example of what and how to resolve it.
Very good, very good. What else? take home with you? One faithful friend who'll never let us down. Yeah, and so, there's passages like Romans 9 talk about putting our confidence in God and you'll never be ashamed. Have you ever put your confidence in a friend or some family member or somebody and they let you down and you're kind of embarrassed that you had great confidence in them and you bragged about them and you told others how good they were and they've let you down? God will never let you down, and that's what the psalmist tells us here. Let's go to Psalm 56 now. Psalm 56. What type of psalm is this? Yeah, a psalm of request for relief. It's a prayer. Again, it's not a messianic psalm. It's not imprecatory, not an acrostic. It's in the classification of a prayer. We've already mentioned David is the author. So what is the message? Subject. Yeah, prayer for relief from tormentors. Psalm 56 and Psalm 57 are twin psalms. But twin psalms, you look at them and say, well, they're not identical. A lot like Psalm 14 and 53. When authors talk about twin psalms, what they mean is they go together. And they're talking about the same subject or the same occasion. And they're very similar in thought. And so Psalm 56 and 57 are thought to be twin psalms. Psalm 58 relates closely to that, though it's not exactly the same. Jensen calls this psalm fear and faith. I like that. So here's what happens in Psalm 56 now. That is a plea to help me in trouble, cast down my enemy, and then he vows and he praises. So we want to get to some things in the other psalms. Not that this psalm is unimportant. But I really wanted to spend more time with Psalm 55. All right, let's look first of all at the occasion of this psalm. Look at the title to the psalm. This is to the silent dove in distant land, a Michtam of David. That Michtam is a mystery word meaning, depending on who you look to, it is thought to be some poem. We've talked about that previously. And it doesn't... it's kind of you may have a translation, it may say something about a mystery, and that really is signifying we don't really know what that word means. But it's some type of poem of David when the Philistines captured him in Gath. Well, that would seem to be the occasion of 1 Samuel 21. If you want to turn there just to get kind of the setting for that, quickly just over to 1 Samuel chapter 21. You remember David, beginning at verse 10, flees to Gath. That's when Achish recognized David, and David then feigned to be crazy. Remember that? Lest they keep him. And this probably is the occasion. And if you want to put a marker there, we're going to come back to 1 Samuel 22 a little bit later and talk about the next psalm, and maybe Psalm 58, but particularly Psalm 57. But be that as it may, let's work through this. Spurgeon said concerning this psalm, the machinery of prayer is not always visible, but it is most efficient. That's interesting. The machinery of prayer is not always visible. You don't always see prayer. You don't always know when it's taking place, but it's most powerful. And he's right about that. And he said that in context with this psalm. So let's look at verses 1 to 4. In verses 1 to 4, it's a plea for God to help him in time of trouble. Man has swallowed me up. Fighting all day, he oppresses me. My enemies would hound me all day. In other words, I'm in the midst of trouble. What else do you see at verse 1 to 4? Yeah, when I'm afraid, I'll put my trust in God. Notice verses 3 and 4, because we're going to hit this again, verse 11 in just a second. In God, I will praise His word. And in God I'll put my trust. The English, who has the English standard? Is that, you have the English standard? Read verse, I've lost my place. Read verse 4.
In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do?
All right, I think that captures the thought of what's going on. In God, whose word I praise and I honor and I respect, in that God I will put my trust. Does that make sense? In other words, what he's told us so far, and we haven't got past verse 4, is I'm surrounded by trouble. And I have tormentors upon me. They're on my heels. The Philistines, apparently. And the Philistines are upon me, and they're upon my heels, and and I'm in the midst of trouble, but I'm going to put my trust in God. The God whose word I respect and I adore. I'll put my trust in God. Make sense? And look at the end of verse 4. I will not fear what flesh can do to me. Now, we'll make a point about the flesh here in just a moment. But I don't have any fear of what man can do when I put my trust in God. And we'll come back to that principle later. Start now at verses 5 through 11. His prayer is that God will cast down the enemy, defeat the enemy. So what do you see in verse 5 through 7? They twist my words, they gather together, they hide, they mark my steps, they lie in wait for me. Shall they escape by iniquity and anger, cast down the people, O God? In other words, these are my enemies. Now, verses 8 through 11, what does he tell us?
That's how God has paid attention to his prayers. He's kept count of his tears in a bottle.
Now, that's an interesting phrase. Look at verse. This is the only time we've seen this so far, and it's the only time I know it's used in the Psalms, that you number my wanderings. In other words, his point is, God, I'm asking for help, and I know you will. In fact, let's drop down to verse 9. This I know because God is for me. I know you're for me. How do I know that? Because you number my wanderings, and you put my tears in your bottle. In other words, God takes note, and God listens, and God responds. How many tears have you shed, David? David doesn't know, but God's kept every one of them in a bottle. Does that make sense? God knew every tear he shed. God knew every sigh he uttered. God takes note of your problems. God knows when you're hurting. God knows when you're crying. God knows. That's what David is saying. My God is for me. In God whose word I praise, I will praise him. I'll put my trust in him. And I'll not be afraid, verse 11, what man can do to me. Now connect verse 11 with verse 4. I'm not concerned what man can do. Because, verse 4, he's nothing but flesh. He's not God. Does that make sense? So man seems all powerful. This whole army of the Philistines seem powerful. But I'm not worried about what they're going to do because they're nothing but flesh. They're not God. Does that make sense? He calls man flesh. Maybe that's a play on words, but I think that's a significant thought. Now let's get 12 and 13. What does he vow to do? I'm going to perform, because vows made are binding. See, I've made a vow, and I'm going to fulfill that vow. And he vows that I will render praises to you. I will deliver my soul from death. Have you ever known someone to make a vow that as soon as I get out of this mess and get through this trouble, I'm going to start going back to church? Pray for me, preacher. Just pray for me, because if I ever get out of this hospital, if I ever get off this bed, if I can ever walk again, if I can ever get going, I'm coming back to church. And as soon as they get back on their feet, forget their vow. Not David. David said, I'm going to praise you. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to walk before God. Questions or comments? What a phrase found in verse, if you don't get anything else, verse, that you put my tears in your bottle. You say, do you ever think I'm shedding tears and nobody knows? God's got every one of your tears in a bottle. You don't even know how many you shed, but God knows. He knows more about it than you do. You say, I don't know how many times I've cried. God's got a record book. He says, I know how many times you cried. I know. Counted every one of them. I don't know how many times I've prayed about this. God knows how many times. He's got a record book. Practical things you learn from 56.
Kind of reminds me of the New Testament where he said, they can kill the body but not the soul.
Yeah, Matthew 10:28. Yes, very good. Good connection. Do you see a connection between reverence? Let me start over. Do you see a connection between reverence for God's Word and trusting God? Verse 4, he mentions that, mentions again verse 10 and 11. There is, someone says, I trust God. Wait a minute, have you been reading His Word? Do you put your confidence? Well, I don't know about all that. No, I know about that. I know because the psalmist connects them, and that tells me you really don't trust God. If you have reverence for His Word, you trust God. If you trust God, you have reverence for His Word. They go hand in hand. They're inseparable. Make sense? What else do you learn? Let's go to 57 just a moment. One more practical lesson if you've got one. From 56. All right, let's go to 57 then. 57. What type of psalm is this? Because it's a twin psalm, that ought to give us a hint. It also is a prayer. And it is a psalm of, about his enemies. David, Psalm of David about his enemies. It's a plea for relief from tormentors again. Similar point. Jensen calls this the prayer and praise mid perils. I like that. All right. Let's see. 2 points here. There's suffering and a plea. But mixed in that is this constant trusting in God. So we saw that in 55, we saw it in 56, we see it in 57. We'll see some of that in 58 as well. All right, what about the occasion? Well, it's a victim of David again when he fled from Saul into the cave. Now, these titles are not put by translators. That's put there in the text by the author and recorded by God. And so that probably is one of two occasions. I think it's probably the first. But you ask for proof only because it seems to follow in sequence to what we just saw in the last psalm. But anyway, for what that's worth, let's go to 1 Samuel 22 for a moment. 1 Samuel 22, we're not going to take the time to read it, but we were just at the end of 21 where David feigned being crazy. Remember that? All right. That was seemingly the occasion of Psalm 56. Well, Psalm 57 is based upon him, according to the wording of the text, when he fled from Saul into the cave. Well, he's doing that in verses 1 through 5. He's at the cave of Adullam. And I've made a note there some time ago. This is probably where Psalm 57 was written. That doesn't make it right because I wrote it there, but I wrote it there because I thought it was right. But that may not be the case. Some think it could be 1 Samuel 24. And in 1 Samuel chapter 24, he fled to the cave at En-gedi. And that may be the occasion. I'm not going to argue the case. I'm not sure I can. I think, in my mind, the greatest argument that is probably 1 Samuel 22 is that followed right on the heels of what he had just seemingly mentioned in Psalm 56. Does that prove anything? Not really. It just makes me feel better, I guess. All right. Psalm 57 now. Let's talk about verses 1 to 6. What do you see here in verses 1 to 6? About his suffering and his plea. He wants to take refuge in God, absolutely. Notice this note of trust. Be merciful to me, for my soul trusts in you. Here's that trust we just saw. And in the shadow of your wings I will take my refuge. So he does want refuge from God. I will cry to the Most High God. To God who performs all things for me. Now that reminds me of what 56:9 said. For my God is for me. Very similar phrase for what that may be worth to us. Now let's look at verse, he shall send from heaven and save me. In other words, I have my trust and my confidence God's going to take care of me and do and provide what I want. I want to drop down now to verse, let's drop down to verse 7. We've got to get verse 7. He praises God. Now he's suffering. He's being tormented, being pursued by Saul. He was fleeing from the Philistines. He's now fleeing from Saul and goes to the cave. And he pleads to God, and I got my trust and my confidence in you. But now look at verse 7. For my heart is steadfast. I like the King James wording of that. My heart is fixed, O God, my heart is steadfast. In other words, in trouble, David's heart was fixed on God. I'll make a good sermon. Is your heart fixed on God? David's heart was fixed on God. His eyes turned upward in the midst of trouble. You say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, look at verse 2. I'll cry to the Most High. He turned upward. My heart is fixed on God. To God who performs all things for me, verse 2. Look at verse 5. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. His eyes turned upward in the midst of troubles. Look at verse 10. For your mercies reach to the heavens and your truth to God. Be exalted, O God. His eyes turned upward. And so verses 7 to 11 is praising to God. My heart is fixed on you. Steadfast, immovable. Now, here's what I'm learning from that. That there's times our hearts are pointed toward God, but they're not fixed. What do I mean by that? My youngest grandson says he'll find something that totters, and he said, that's not stable. If my heart's not fixed, it's not attached, it's not stable. Something could move it. Does that make sense? But in the midst of torment, in the midst of troubles, if your heart's fixed on God, it's not going to move. Make sense? That's what the psalmist said. Practical things you learn from 57. We're going to hit 58 quickly here in a minute. What do you learn from 57? All right, still turns to God. Our troubles, we're learning this again. Trouble should not drive us from God. Our trouble should drive us to God. Our trouble shouldn't get us off our knees and run away. Our trouble should drive us to our knees. There's something else I'm learning from this, that he thinks of God in time of trouble rather than having a woe is me. How many people do you know that have troubles and their whole countenance is, woe is me, woe is me. I've got troubles, I've got troubles, I've got troubles. And if you didn't know it, let me tell you my troubles. And whether you want to hear it or not, you're going to hear about my troubles. And David said, yeah, I've got troubles, but my focus is on God. Make sense? Psalm 58. What type of psalm do we have here? It's a psalm dealing with, several psalms deal with this subject. Dealing with judgment. It's a judgment psalm. Depending on whose classifications you looked at, some may not even list that as one of the classifications, but it's a psalm of David. Message. Judgment on the wicked. Now, let's quickly get as what we can of this. This may have reference to some of the counselors of Saul who are in positions of power. Our time is about gone. We got about a minute and a half, so I'm going to give you some high points I wanted us to hit in this psalm. Here's a rebuke of the wicked enemy. And then I think this is in the brackets over here are Jensen. The overthrow of the wicked and the judgment is just. But what I want you to notice is a couple of things. But indeed, look at verse 1. Do you indeed speak righteousness, you silent ones? Here's what I'm learning from that. When those in positions of power are silent rather than dealing with the sin or the crime or the wickedness, they are endorsing the wickedness. And that's what the psalmist is saying. So whether it be a judge, whether it be the leaders, be leaders in the church, leaders in the family, when there is something going on that shouldn't be and you are silent, you just gave your endorsement to that. You say, where'd you learn that? I learned that from verse 1 of Psalm 58. Is where I learned that. Makes sense? Now, this is quite interesting. This verses 1 to 5 talks about the wicked and their nature. They devise wickedness. They live the life of sin. They're dishonest. They're stubborn, like a cobra that can't be charmed. And so the plea is for God to overthrow the wicked, and God's judgment is just. But notice, I've got to hit this, and then we're going to be done. Look at verse 9. Before your pots can fill the burning thorns. Here's a pot that's heated by the thorns that burn quickly, by the way, real quick. Thorns, it's not like a wet piece of wood that's hard to burn. Thorns burn quickly. And before the pot that you put over the burning thorns, before the pot can feel the heat, you shall take them away in a whirlwind, and as his living or burning wrath, whether wet or dry. In other words, God's going to quickly take them away. God's going to deal with the wicked in his time, and he'll quickly take them away. Does that make sense? Before the pot can feel the heat from the burning of the thorns, God's going to take it away. Judgment is just. Judgment on the wicked is just. Very similar in nature to Psalm 56 and 57, those twin Psalms. All right, time's gone. We'll have to leave it at that. But we got Psalm 55, a major psalm.